Have you ever wanted to trigger things inside of VNyan from SAMMI? What about having VNyan make stuff happen inside of SAMMI? Well, if you're watching this video, you probably have, and I'll show you how to do both of these things. Before we go too far, I'm Swolecat. I've been a VTuber for a while, and I've been maintaining the VNyan SAMMI extension for 3 years now. Jesus. Anyways, a lot has changed during that time for both of these programs, so it's high time that there's a new version. This is a breaking change, so if you've already set up the extension, you might want to keep watching to find out what the changes are. Speaking of which, the biggest change now is that besides the VNyan SAMMI extension, there is also the SAMMI VNyan plugin. Confusing, I know. Let me explain. When I first made the extension, I had one-way communication from SAMMI to VNyan. I had eventually wanted two-way communication, so I cobbled together this really complicated solution where I had a web server that proxied WebSockets between the two apps. Along the way, VNyan introduced an HTTP server as well as plugins. The web server that I made is really complicated for people who aren't super technical to install and leads to a lot of issues. So recently I figured I'd take another approach that's a lot more understandable and less prone to installation issues. The big revelation is now that there are two parts that have one-way communication. First is the classic VNyan SAMMI extension, which I will refer to as the extension in this video. The extension is for communication from SAMMI to VNyan. Conversely, the SAMMI VNyan plugin, referred to as the plugin, goes from VNyan to SAMMI. Both of these can work together in the same setup, but if you only want to go one way, just use the one you want. I'm going to go in depth on how to install and use each of these, but before I go too far, I'm going to assume that you both have VNyan and SAMMI set up. If you don't have SAMMI set up, please follow the instructions on their website. I'll leave a link in the description to their Getting Started guide. For VNyan, all you really need to do is install it, so there's not much there. Each of these have settings that you need to enable, but I will go over those as they come up. Okay, so let's start with the classic VNyan SAMMI extension. Reminder that this is to go from SAMMI to VNyan. If you want to go the opposite direction, check out the SAMMI VNyan plugin. Inside SAMMI, go into the bridge menu and select Install an Extension. Then find the SEF file that you downloaded from the GitHub release page. Very important, this guide is for 4.0.0 and higher. Lower versions have a much more complicated installation setup, but for this version, that is it. Now, there are two ways to go about sending data to VNyan. The first I'll go over is VNyan API message. This uses VNyan's REST API that runs on port 8069, unless Suve has finally heard my pleas and let you change it. Look, I know I'm the only person in the universe who wants it to be on a separate port, but please, I need this so I can switch Swolebay over to use HTTP as well. I would really appreciate it. All right, rant over. Anyways, you can send all sorts of data through the API, so I would generally recommend using this command all the time. The second command is VNyan SAMMI message, which uses WebSockets. You need to enable WebSockets inside a VNyan setting page under the MISC tab. It'll be called Start Receiver. This is mostly here for people like me who have already set up the extension and don't, or in my case, can't switch. Important note for legacy users, the VNyan extension trigger does not work anymore. Instead, use the brand new SAMMI VNyan plugin, which I will now explain. The plugin is on a GitHub page that I will link in the description. You'll download the zip file, unzip it, and place it into your VNyan folder. You'll know you did it right if there's a DLL and a VN-OBJ file under items/assemblies. One thing I forgot to say when recording this video is that you need to enable VNyan plugins. To do this, you go into the MISC settings and turn on Allow Third-Party Mod/Plugins Requires Restart. You will have to restart VNyan if you don't already have this turned on. You can now launch VNyan, and if you go into the plugin list, you'll see SAMMI listed. Before we get started setting up nodes, you actually need to enable the SAMMI API. To do this, go into Settings, then Connections, and check Open Local API Server. Leave the password blank because there are not enough params for me to handle that. All VNyan plugins that interact with nodes use the call trigger node. There are two triggers that my plugin uses, SAMMI trigger button and SAMMI set button variable. SAMMI trigger button will trigger a button inside of SAMMI. It uses text1 as the button ID. SAMMI set button variable will let you set a variable inside of a SAMMI button. This can be very useful to set variables and then have SAMMI use them when the button gets triggered. Text1 is still the button ID, just like the other trigger. Text2 is the name of the variable. Finally, you can either use text3 or value1 to set the value of the variable, depending on if your value is a string or a number. And that's it. I find this a lot easier to use than the old version, and I hope you will too. If you want to be cool, stop by my stream, which is either here on Twitch. Otherwise, I'll see you guys around. Later!